Living in community. This article sets out the biblical basis of living in an intentional community and its differences with the traditional religious system. In the book of Acts, we read that the early Christians lived in community. Acts 2, verse 44. They renounced all their possessions in obedience to the teachings of Jesus. Luke 12, verses 32 to 33, Luke 14, verse 33, Acts 2, verse 45. And worked together daily to serve God. Matthew 6, verse 24, and Acts 2, verses 46 to 47. There is no doubt that such an example of unity and love revolutionized the world. Today, churches teach that living in community and obeying Jesus, as the early Christians did, was only possible 2,000 years ago. They argue that times have changed, and that living in Christian community is not important. Moreover, when one talks about living in community, it is often seen with suspicion and caution. However, living in community is an important ingredient for a truly Christian life. Jesus sent his disciples 2 by 2, Luke 10, verse 1, in accordance with the biblical principle of 2 or 3 witnesses, Matthew 18, verse 16, 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1, and 1 Timothy 5, verse 19. Jesus said that he himself would be present where at least 2 or 3 are together in his name, Matthew 18, verse 20. Jesus taught that the most concrete way people can know that we are his disciples is through our love for each other, John 13, verse 35. The world can believe in Jesus only when we, who follow Jesus, are in true unity, John 17, verse 11, and John 17, verse 23. People often ask whether living in a Christian community is a requirement for their salvation. Such people are interested in knowing the least thing that needs to be done in order not to go to hell. The question should not be whether living in community is our ticket to heaven, but whether living in community is going to help us become better Christians by providing us with an opportunity to develop more spiritually and give a better testimony of Jesus to the world. In addition to missing out on all the benefits of living in a Christian community, if we truly want to follow Christ, wouldn't it be nonsensical for us to not want to be in community with other Christians who also sincerely want to follow Christ? Suppose there are 100 people in the maze and they are totally lost. Suppose that 90 of the people do not care that they are lost and they decide to make a picnic and do everything possible to enjoy their stay in the maze. But there are 10 other people who desperately want to get out of there. Wouldn't it be natural to conclude that the 10 who are genuinely seeking a solution to the maze will be drawn to each other? Wouldn't they be more likely to find the way out if they shared their own experiences of the different parts of the maze with each other? Wouldn't it help them to work together in unity to find the solution? Something is wrong if we say that we have been seeking truth, but we do not want to have fellowship with others who are also seeking and practicing the truth. The Apostle John would ask, "How can you say that you want fellowship with God, whom you have not seen, if you do not want fellowship with your Christian brothers and sisters, whom you have seen?" 1 John 4, verse 20. If you prefer company with people who do not obey Jesus, whether religious or not, to the company of people who have given their whole lives to serve Christ, it says something about your personal commitment to Jesus. Unfortunately, today, finding a group of people who are truly committed to following Christ seems to be more difficult than finding liquid gold. The world is full of churches that claim to be in communion for a couple of hours a week and where they call you brother because they do not remember your name. These false churches have left many burned and have created a spirit of skepticism against any group that tries to do things right. We understand perfectly well that the hypocritical environment of the religious system does not foster the desire or provide people with the possibility of having true communion through living in a Christian community with others. But when you find people who are dedicated to God, the most natural thing would be to want to be with them for as long as possible. If we are truly Christians, then we will feel more alone in the world and more attracted to true Christian brothers and sisters. If we walk in the light of God, and you walk in the light of God, then the obvious thing is to have fellowship with one another. 1 John 1, verse 7. Christian community versus religious systems. Please first read our article, Living in Christian Community, in order to understand the biblical basis for what it means to live in a Christian community. When we take seriously the concept of living in a Christian community, and we join together in unity with others to serve God, many Bible verses take on a greater meaning than what we see reflected in the practice of individuals within the religious system. Let's take, for example, the following commandment: love each other in the way that Jesus loved us. John 13, verse 34, John 15, verse 12, 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 12, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 9, 1 Peter 1, verse 22, 1 John 3, verse 11, 1 John 3, verse 23, 1 John 4, verse 7, 1 John 4, verse 11, and 2 John 1, verse 5. This commandment, repeated so many times in the Bible, has a much deeper significance than just getting together a couple of days a week for a couple of hours. Love is, in reality, the only commandment that we have to practice among ourselves. All of the other commandments show us how to fulfill that one command. Galatians 5, verse 14, and Romans 13, verses 8 to 10. In 1 John 3, verse 16, we read, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." This is the love that Jesus taught us to have for each other. But have you found a church where people truly give their lives for their brothers? The truth is that in many cases they don't even know what is happening in the lives of others, since from Monday to Saturday, each person does their own thing. Some manage to meet on Wednesday or Thursday nights to study the Bible, but in day-to-day life, each person organizes themselves as they please. Are most churchgoers willing to lend their car to a brother? Are they willing to sell their car, TV, PlayStation, etc. in order to pay for an operation for another? Are they willing to miss work if someone else needs their help? Are they willing to invite their brother to live with them in their house until they can find a better place to stay? And this is without even mentioning being genuinely willing to die for each other. The truth is that the love that the religious system offers is a love that doesn't cost anything personally. It is a superficial, shallow love. When we live in true Christian community, 7 days a week, with other brothers and sisters, our whole life, our time, is literally given for others. After renouncing all that we have, Luke 18, verse 33, and Luke 14, verse 33, everything we now have belongs to God, and not ourselves, being under the administration of the Christian community. As a result, there is no one in need amongst the members. Acts 4, verses 32 to 35. In a Christian community, we have the same mind and purpose as others, and we unanimously work together to glorify Jesus. Romans 15, verses 5 to 6, and 1 Peter 3, verse 8. In contrast, in the religious system, each person is seeking his own glory, which results in them competing for positions of importance. This is clearly seen when the leaders, and those that aspire to be leaders, use titles of respect such as pastor, reverend, teacher, father, etc., instead of fostering an environment where people are recognized as brothers and sisters. Matthew 23, verses 8 to 12. In a Christian community, we are a united body. Romans 12, verse 5, and 1 Corinthians 12, verse 55. If one person has a problem, we all have a problem. We each need to bear one another's burdens. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 16, and Galatians 6, verse 2. In comparison, in a religious system, the body exists only 1 day a week, and is mostly concerned about such things as the speakers sounding good, that someone looks after the children for a couple of hours, that the seats are comfortable, and that the songbooks are returned to the door at the end of the service. On Monday, everyone goes back to working on their own individual goals and plans, which usually involve working for money. No one works on a daily basis for a common purpose. If a member has a personal problem, it is their problem. Often, by way of their religious doctrines, the leaders of the religious system place heavy burdens on their members, but don't lift a finger to help them with their load. Luke 11, verse 46. If the leaders themselves aren't willing to help the members of their church, it is even less likely that the members will help each other. There is no sense of responsibility toward helping someone else with a complicated situation. especially since that person is not likely to help anyone else out either. In a Christian community, we exhort one another every day, and we don't stop congregating together. Colossians 3 verse 16, Romans 15 verse 14, Hebrews 3 verse 13, and Hebrews 10 verse 25. We work together, we eat together, and we play together. We truly enjoy one another's company. Our best friends are our brothers and sisters who live with us full time. Luke 8 verse 21. But in the religious system, the exhortation only comes by way of a magazine or a sermon by the pastor. If one member tries to exhort another, often the response is, "Who are you to say that to me?" In most cases, people get together at church not because their best friends are there with whom they share all things in common, nor because the truth is preached there, but for fear of going to hell if they are not faithful. Perhaps they have gone to that church since they were children, or because they like the music and the sermons are entertaining, or simply because it's the closest church to where they live and they haven't found anywhere better. In the religious system, it's very difficult to learn to destroy your pride. In a Christian community, we submit ourselves to one another. Ephesians 5 verse 21, 1 Peter 5 verse 5. Forsaking ourselves for the sake of one another. In the religious system, you don't have to submit yourself to anyone except perhaps the pastor. And if you have to submit yourself to the pastor, it is often only with respect to some theological doctrine that you only need to accept intellectually or superficially, while in your daily life you can do what you like, as long as you keep coming back each Saturday or Sunday, and don't forget to bring your tithe and offering. In a Christian community, since we live together, we have to truly practice forgiveness. Ephesians 4 verse 32, Colossians 3 verse 13. Compassion. Ephesians 4 verse 32, 1 Peter 3 verse 8. And patience. Ephesians 4 verse 2, Colossians 3 verse 13. We confess our sins to one another. James 5 verse 16. If someone does something against someone else, steps are taken to resolve the problem. First between those two alone. If it cannot be resolved, 2 or 3 witnesses are asked to assist. And if it still cannot be resolved, the whole community is called on to help. Matthew 18 verses 15 to 17. Read the article Disagreements for more information. In the religious system, if a person does not get along with someone else, they can sit on the opposite side of the church, change the day or time they go to a meeting, and generally just avoid that person, without it affecting the meeting in the slightest way. There is often murmuring and gossiping about the faults of others, and problems between members don't get resolved. If any sins are confessed, it is often only with the priest or pastor, and it's easy to live a secret life in which one can sin without others knowing about it. Living in Christian community is completely different to what the world offers, and that includes what the religious system offers. We can't say that we love one another if we are not willing to share our lives with each other. If you are a person that truly wants to follow Christ, find at least 1 or 2 people who also want to follow Jesus and have unity with you, even if it is just your husband or wife. But don't just limit yourself to 2 or 3, especially if you know of more people who want to live for Christ. And since you are reading this article, we are offering ourselves as a Christian community, willing to work with you in obeying Jesus, if this is what you also genuinely want. How about it? Christian service. Within our community, and even within most other Christian denominations, the most heavily emphasized form of ministry is preaching. In many ways, it is understandable, as it was Jesus' final command to his disciples before ascending up into heaven, Mark 16 and Matthew 28. But that is not the only ministerial service we are commanded to engage in as Christians. Besides preaching, we are also commanded to serve one another in love, and it is this latter form of ministry that we hope to address in this article. There are many activities necessary in order to sustain an effective and efficient Christian community. Washing clothes, doing dishes, and maintaining a vehicle would be 3 such activities. Still, many Christians approach such jobs carelessly, as if these less glamorous jobs do not require us to do them with our whole heart. This should not be so. In most organizations, and especially in full-time communities like our own, people do not have the latitude to handpick every activity that they do. Sometimes jobs are picked for us. That is a realistic picture of the dynamics of cooperating with others while working as part of a bigger team/group. It seems that when we are given duties and responsibilities that are not of our own choosing, it is when we are most inclined to slack off, complain, drag our feet, and just generally not make a strong effort to ensure that our particular responsibility is cared for diligently. Sadly, there are some people who slack off even when they get to pick their activities. This tendency to be less than enthusiastic about some jobs is understandable. We naturally do most enthusiastically what we have freely chosen to do. But one part of the Christian message is that Jesus, through his Spirit, gives us power to transform our nature from its instinctive, selfish state to make it conform to God's selfless nature. Being in the Spirit means choosing what God wants over what we want. And so, with that in mind, I tend to question the sincerity of Christians who undertake jobs without putting their whole heart into them, simply because they don't like the job, because it wasn't their choice, or because they can't see the point in doing it. What is really happening inside an individual's spirit when they make excuses like that for doing a poor job? You can rest assured that it isn't good. So why is it that so many Christians still take this grumbling attitude? Remember that God sees everything that we do. No matter how menial or seemingly insignificant a particular task may seem in our mind, God still cares about it. He's still watching and looking for enthusiasm from each of us. A vision of God and eternity is something that needs to be with us all, at all times, 24/7. It's not something you can turn on and off like a faucet. This eternal vision of doing everything as if we were doing it for God should have a knock-on effect with everything that we do. To sum up, every activity that we engage in as Christians should be a visible reflection of the inward invisible relationship that we have with Christ. It is all part of our witness to the world. When people get this vision, it should revolutionize all that they do. Those dishes you're washing, they're God's dishes. That floor you're sweeping, it's God's floor. You're working for God. He is your provider, and it is Him that you are really serving. So let us never lose sight of this eternal perspective, and let us do all things, no matter what they may be, to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. Anything else, on a myriad of levels, really is just a waste of time. Resolving disagreements. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Matthew 18, verses 15 to 17. In every group there will be disagreements. Disagreements can be very serious and lead to divisions. But Jesus gives us the teaching above as an easy way to resolve disagreements within the group. Although the passage seems to be specifically speaking about when a brother sins, we have found that this is a very useful model for resolving disagreements between any two people. The first step in resolving a complaint is to talk to the person we disagree with. This shows that we really want to solve the problem and give the other person an opportunity to explain the disagreement from their point of view. What we should not do is tell others about the disagreement we have with that person. There are many names for this action of talking in secret with others about a disagreement we have with another, including murmuring, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 20, Philippians 2, verse 14, detracting, Romans 1, verse 30, and gossiping, etc. It is not even necessary to talk to a leader about a disagreement we have with another person. It is cruel to whomever we disagree with if we say things against them when they are not present to defend themselves or give an answer. Note: there may be times when we cannot talk to someone face to face. If the person does not want to talk to us, then they will not be present when we talk about our disagreement. But if this happens, it is very important that we do not say anything we do not want the other person to hear us say. We should be willing to tell them everything we say to others about them to their face. Leaders should not say that they have to talk about followers when followers are not present. Some people give reasons like, if we talk about the problem, we'll know how to pray for that person better. This is not true, and is not a valid reason to break the rules of Jesus. God knows everything we need to know about the problem, and others do not need to know the details so we can pray about it. Many disagreements can be resolved, and can even help to deepen the friendship when two people who disagree talk face to face about the problem. As we mentioned earlier, when we confront the person in disagreement with love, we demonstrate that we are willing to listen to what the other person has to say. We also show that we do not want to hurt them by gossiping about them, and that we are serious about wanting to solve the disagreement. James 5, verses 19 to 20. It is helpful to remember the importance of how one approaches someone with a complaint. Jesus warned that we will be judged in the same way that we judge others. He told us not to be hypocrites who try to take a speck from our brother's eye, while we have a beam blinding our own. First, we need to take the beam out of our own eye, so that we can see clearly enough to be able to help clean the eye of our brother. Matthew 7, verses 1 to 5. In other words, we need to look at the condition of our own spirit before we try to correct others. If we address someone with anger and aggression, we will not only be doing the wrong thing, but we will probably not be very effective in resolving the problem. Instead, the Bible teaches us to correct others with a spirit of meekness. Galatians 6, verse 1. If we cannot solve the disagreement in this way, the second step is to ask for help from one or two people who will act as witnesses and counselors in a disagreement. These people should help the two people who disagree with each other to really listen and to understand each other's position. Sometimes witnesses who are asked to help with the problem try to say that there is no problem. This can often be an indication that witnesses are being lazy. If there were no problems, they would not have been asked to help in the first place. If someone asks you to help two people with a disagreement, try not to say things like, they just have a personality difference, or that they are equally wrong. There is a problem, and you have to find the best way to solve it. There will be times when such phrases will be useful, but often they are not. If we close our eyes and wait for the problem to go away, this will not help. Good witnesses will listen very carefully to what the two people are saying. They will learn to see the spirit behind what they say, to see why they are saying something. If a person does not want to talk about the problem, in most cases this is an indication that the person knows they are wrong. A person who hides from the truth does not want others to hear the truth. When one person in a disagreement tries to hurt the other person with words, this is an indication that they have a bad spirit as well. It's helpful to look for clues that the people involved are serious about trying to solve the problem, and to try and dissuade them from trying to hurt the other person. If one of the people in the disagreement is not happy about sharing with one or two witnesses present, the last step is to bring the disagreement to the whole group. Most disagreements are resolved before this happens, but if it is not resolved, we have to understand that the problem is serious. If the group is not able to solve the problem, then the group will be forced to decide which person is most guilty and ask that person to leave the group. 1 Corinthians 5, verse 5. When a person is fighting the truth, they do not really want to be in the group. Often the longer they stay in the group, the more bitter they will get about these reconciliation meetings. Sometimes these meetings are used as a way to fight the group before the person leaves. Meetings can be used as an opportunity to vent all the complaints they have, not only against the other person, but also against the group. There are people who want to stay, but who have been lazy about fighting evil spirits in themselves. In these cases, they could take advantage of some days of prayer and fasting. This is something we have added to the 3-stage plan Jesus teaches. Giving someone the option to pray and fast is not done to punish the person, but as a last-ditch attempt to help that person get serious about resolving their inner conflict, in order to enable them to continue in communion with others. If the person wants to try fasting and praying for a few days, they can do so in a place where they are alone, still, if necessary, physically away from where the group meets, and then return for another meeting with the whole group at a later point. For most people, this quiet prayer time is enough to overcome an evil spirit. If the group feels that the person has stopped having a bad spirit and the disagreement can be resolved, the person can return to the group. There may be exceptions to this way of resolving conflicts, such as when Paul advised to publicly rebuke those who continue sinning, 1 Timothy 5, verse 20. In that same passage, Paul warned against accepting a testimony against an elder without 2 or 3 witnesses. We do not understand exactly how to practice this, but the lesson is that we should treat the elder with respect, and to some extent, trust their experience. We should always carry our disagreements and grievances with a spirit of love and humility. Having a spirit of prayer during reconciliation meetings is important in order to resolve the disagreement faster. Unfortunately, many people today do not want to resolve their disagreements, and the fruit of this is a world in which friendships come and go. Another fruit is a world divided against itself, Matthew 12, verse 25. Problems are often exaggerated in our minds if we do not listen to the other point of view, and often these exaggerations do not end up being confronted. But for those of us who have renounced everything for Christ, and who live in full-time community like the early Christians, Acts 4 verses 32 to 35, allowing disagreements to remain unresolved and fester is not an option. Living together in love and harmony requires solving every problem that arises between us. As Paul said to the Ephesians, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." Ephesians 4 verses 26 to 27. Part of the reason why many people in the world do not want to face disagreements is because they are afraid of the conflict, or they have doubts about their own complaint. However, in order to have deeper relationships, it is necessary to resolve disagreements instead of ceasing to be someone's friend, without actually attempting to resolve the problem with them. Moreover, Jesus taught that it is not possible to please God if we do not do everything necessary to resolve our disagreements with our brothers and sisters. Matthew 5 verse 24. The simple three-step plan that Jesus taught about resolving disagreements can solve problems of any kind and in any group, if only people use it. We have found that the more we use it, the more united we are as a community. Job lists, budgets, and schedules. One of the best inventions in history must be that of daily schedules. Wristwatches, especially cheap wristwatches, must be the next best invention. They made it possible for virtually everyone to coordinate their various schedules so that people could arrange to be in the same place at the same time. Today, it would be unthinkable for a company executive to try to operate without a daily schedule or a wristwatch. Similarly, it would be unthinkable for a company to operate without keeping a budget. Such a budget would not only record what they spend, but would also set limits on what they would be allowed to spend. Yet, in spiritual situations like our own, there seems to be an almost superhuman resistance to keeping schedules, budgets, or personal job lists. Often the reason for this overwhelming pressure to do away with such things is that people, in general, do not want to be accountable. They don't have much choice when it comes to their jobs or to government regulations, and so they conform in those areas, even if they do so grudgingly. But in spiritual matters, it is far easier to at least think you can get away with not being accountable, because God doesn't immediately slap you in jail for failing to do what He has told you to do. The devil works in 1,000 different ways to make people rebel against accountability. Keeping them from making a list or some other objective measurement of their progress is one of the best ways to do that. The arguments against such discipline always sound spiritual. People argue that they want to be spontaneous or flexible, and they don't want to be under the law. But the fruit of such an approach is pathetic, no matter what area of life you are considering. Pentecostals are probably one of the worst group of offenders in this area, and of all the various denominations, they also have one of the worst records with regard to unpaid debts, mental illnesses, and broken marriages amongst their membership. Amongst Pentecostals there are individuals and churches which try hard to overcome these deficits in their members, and they are to be commended for it. But they will never succeed if they accept a theology which justifies lack of accountability with regard to how we use our time and money. Pentecostals or people of any other persuasion who are genuinely trying to teach accountability will applaud the overall message that we are trying to communicate through this study. A number of our own community members have confided that they have a secret fantasy about a bohemian or New Age type utopia where there are no rules and yet everything works smoothly. This is the image that many people have when they first approach the idea of living in a Christian community like our own. They want a world where everyone is nice to them, but where they don't have to make the same sacrifices to be nice in return. It is the number one reason why communities fail. Until we see where the bohemian fantasy is leading, you will be forever double-minded about all of the routine disciplines of living in a successful community. Things like budgets, schedules, and job lists will be left undone, or we will cheat on them whenever we get the chance. Jesus said of his followers that their righteousness needed to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. No one has ever been more spiritual than Jesus, and yet he and his followers were also extremely disciplined, even to the point of laying down their lives for God and for others. He wants us to follow that example of discipline today, in order for our righteousness to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. We have said in the past that our time is our life, and if we want to give our lives to God, then we must be willing to give him our time. Making a schedule or a job list is one way to measure just how much progress we are making in that direction. There really is nothing spiritually beneficial about spacing out and wasting time. It is one of the most insidious forms of suicide that the devil has ever devised. People go for hours, days, and finally years without really achieving anything, because they convince themselves that all God wants is for them to be undisciplined. It is foolish to believe this. God is looking for disciples, that is, disciplined people, and not for smiley airheads who wander around in a constant state of spiritual confusion. If we see someone teaching anarchy, for example, but they seem to have their lives, their families, and maybe even their organizations together, then we can be sure that it did not come as a result of practicing the anarchy that they preach. It came from discipline. It came from making lists of things that needed to be done, and then checking those lists to see if they had been accomplished. It came from setting goals, and then assessing whether or not they were reached. It came from making schedules, and then sticking to them, unless there was a genuine justification for making an exception. It came from keeping a budget and paying bills on time. It came from living within their means. We don't learn these sort of things from living in hippie communes. We learn them from other people who make us accountable. Parents who do not discipline their children will never raise children who are just naturally and spontaneously disciplined. If their children learn discipline at all, they will have to learn it from teachers who discipline them, employers who discipline them, military leaders who discipline them, or penal institutions that discipline them. It's not particularly clear where we fit in on this list. Some see us as a family, and others see us as a prison. But either way, we're trying to teach our members discipline, setting targets and making resolutions, and then keeping a record of how successful we have been in achieving our aims. It's just one of many ways that we try to make people accountable for their spiritual progress. There are always aspects of spiritual growth which cannot be measured, and which are purely between us and God. But wherever we can objectify progress, we seek to measure it, and the fruit of this approach has been greater progress. It is helpful to ask ourselves whether we are praying more now than we did a year ago. Are we reading our Bible more? Are we getting along with other people better? Are we reaching more people for Christ? Are we doing more to help the poor? If we don't like these questions, we can always make some of our own. We can set goals for ourselves and then keep an account to determine whether or not we are making progress. The Bible says that if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. And one of the best ways to do it is through such things as budgets, schedules, and job lists. Happy measuring. Why communities fail. Greed. Many alternative lifestyles seek an answer to greed. They see what it has done to human relationships, and they want to form a community where greed is no longer a problem. Unfortunately, everyone seems to define a greedy person as one who wants more material goods than I want. Simplifying our lifestyle is commendable. Like a smoker who reduces his or her consumption of cigarettes, we're headed in the right direction. But until we break the habit altogether, it is very likely that in a time of emotional crises, we will move back in the other direction, and then our failure will only serve to convince us that if we can't beat the habit, whether cigarettes or greed, we may as well give in to it entirely. As Christians, we understand that Jesus never taught people to cut down on their quest for material goods. He sought to eliminate the quest altogether, and to replace it with a quest for faith, love, and honesty. Jesus skips right over luxuries and challenges our desire for what we would call basic necessities. Seek not what you shall eat or what you shall drink. Luke 12, verse 29. Labour not for the food that perishes. John 6, verse 27. Take no thought for food or clothing. Matthew 6, verse 31. Most alternative lifestyle communities fall into the trap of becoming cottage industries. But grassroots capitalism is hardly a viable alternative to the real problem of greed. Successful cottage industries are still heading in the same direction as the multinationals. The fact that we subscribe to other ideals is not unique. Colonel Sanders, for example, once had a policy of giving leftover food to the needy, but Kentucky Fried Chicken was still a multinational at heart, and cottage industries are still materialistic at heart. Their products may not be computers and automobiles, but selling knickknacks, dealing in drugs, or even starting a health food restaurant doesn't really weed out the root of all evil. People who try to set up a business for the purpose of using the money to support some other ideal still end up worrying, arguing, and finally splitting up over the operation of the business. If we want the business to succeed, we should recruit people for whom the success of the business is the most important goal. McDonald's can tell you that. But if we want to resist greed, then we must recruit people for whom the war against greed is the most important objective. Focusing on the war against greed is the first key to success. Pride. Most people seeking an alternative to the rat race are fiercely independent. We have to be, to even begin to challenge the overwhelming pressures of mainstream society. But if we are going to succeed in offering society a lasting sample of something better, we must learn to cooperate with people of like mind. We must learn to listen and learn to follow. In every community, everyone has an opinion, but not everyone has the answers. A good leader will learn to recognize truth regardless of what source it comes from, and he or she will alter his or her own opinions when they do not conform with the truth. But it's important not to fall for the myth that everyone is equally equipped to teach the rest of the group how things should be done. Experience must be respected and listened to. If a goal has been established for a community, then everyone must be expected to subscribe to that goal. Some form of authority must be recognized, even if it is the authority of popular opinion, that is, majority rules. The group must have the courage to discipline those who are disruptive, or who behave contrary to the purpose of the community. The very word community suggests that people in it have some common unity. If people cannot submit to the goals and practices of the community, then they have already expelled themselves from it. Some people, for example, who like the ideals espoused in the teachings of Jesus, are offended by frequent references to Jesus. But since he is the authority and source of those teachings, it's only fair to give him some recognition. If we're too proud to submit to him and recognize his wisdom, we'd be too proud to submit to or recognize the wisdom of anyone. Such pride must be smashed before individuals can successfully work together in unity. Laziness. If any would not work, then neither should they eat. 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10. This instruction from the Apostle Paul to the first century Christian community is still important for any successful community today. Too often people are drawn to alternative lifestyles on the false assumption that they offer an escape from all responsibility and discomfort. But the most successful communities are those which see themselves as possessing an urgent mission to the outside world. Anyone in the community who is not prepared to work on that mission should not be in the community. Many who look for an alternative lifestyle seem to think that if they close their eyes and wish real hard, all their problems will go away. But such escapism will not solve the problems of the real world. Jesus said, "Unless your righteousness shall exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5 verse 20. In other words, unless you are willing to work harder than people do for the system, you'll never succeed in building an alternative community. People who wouldn't think of turning up late for a system job often assume that in an alternative lifestyle community, one wakes up late and spends most of the day talking, joking, reading trivia, handling a few tiny bits of business, and just generally doing the sort of things they would have squeezed into their lunch hour or the weekend when they were working in a job. It is advisable to see the community as a business, with us as its joint owners. If we don't produce, we'll fail. What we produce may not be material, but it still requires time, concentration, and energy to make it work. Whether we are working to educate people on noble values, or just working to build loving relationships, it is important to be ever conscious of what we are doing and why we are doing it. Many communities fail because people are too lazy to discipline their thoughts, speech, and actions in such a way as to produce the kind of vibes that they claim to believe in. Impatience. When people finally have their act together and are working diligently in unity with one another, the final hurdle they must clear is impatience. Radical activists of all sorts suffer from burnout because they had high hopes that were not realized as quickly or as dramatically as they had first expected. Unless your community has a limitless supply of aspiring hopefuls to replace disillusioned burnouts, it is wise to seriously caution everyone in the community against expecting too much too soon. And every effort must be made to recognize and savor the tiniest indications that the community is having some effect on the world around it. People need to have commitment to some ideals as ends in themselves, whether or not we ever succeed in converting others to them. This we call taking up one's cross. Jesus was one of many great leaders who was never truly appreciated until after his death. And this may be the kind of dedication it is going to take to capture the imagination of today's cynical world. In conclusion, the standards outlined in this article are high, but they are not beyond the reach of the average individual. It is just a matter of each person's individual choice. Fun communities may be here one day and gone the next, but if we wish to start something that will last 100 years or that will change the world, we need the kind of dedication laid out in this article for us to have any chance of making it work. Practical tips for building and sustaining a community. This article explores several key points of consideration for those who want to establish a Christian community. There are many issues that are necessary to understand in order for a community to function well. We have already covered several of these topics in other articles, for example, living in community, community challenges, Christian leaders, etc. And the concepts we have mentioned in other articles dealing with personal spiritual growth, e.g. pride, laziness, etc., are also essential for the success of a community, whether Christian or otherwise. Anyone who wishes to start a community would do well to pay attention to the truths mentioned in such articles. Our community is a Christian community based on the teachings of Jesus. However, in this article we will try to share information that will help any community, even though it will be most useful for those people seeking to form a Christian community. Different communities will naturally emphasize some points more than others. However, the suggestions included here should at least give a general idea of the kind of issues that need to be considered when forming any type of community. The importance of unity. The point of greatest importance, and one that can easily be forgotten, is that there needs to be common unity in order for a community to exist. In other words, people who want to form a community have to be clear what the foundation or the constitution of the community is. In our case, our unity has been founded on obedience to Jesus. Anyone who does not have the desire to obey Jesus will, sooner or later, either choose to leave or be asked to leave the community. Other communities may have a different basis for their unity. For example, in a case where a group of people do not believe in obeying Jesus, but do believe in doing community work, a community could be formed on that premise. It is important to be very clear what the foundation of the community will be before getting set up. If this does not get clearly communicated, sooner or later there will be big problems. Similar to a marriage in which neither party speaks about fundamental issues, like whether or not to have children, their level of commitment to God, material goals, etc., before tying the knot. Some of the topics mentioned in this article can serve as a guide to clarify what level of unity there is between those people who desire to form a community and how to maintain it. What kind of ministry? Depending on the mission or aims of the community, the members will normally do some kind of work. Even when a Christian community decides to work full-time for God, there are a variety of ways in which this mission can be carried out. For us, distributing Christian literature to the public has been the bulk of our work to date, although we have also experimented with a number of other projects and ministries as well. In general, we do free work. In other words, whatever work we do, whether it be distributing literature or some other project, we do for others freely, accepting donations in cases where people wish to donate something of their own free will, without any kind of commitment on their part. Donations can be in the form of money, food, accommodation, or some other resource. The danger of this focus, of handing out materials on a donation basis, is that our work often generates an income. Although many communities would see that as positive, we recognize the spiritual danger in it. Unless our goal is to spread the message or show love to people in the best way possible, without worrying whether this generates an income, the community would probably backslide from the will of God. We always need to remain open to finding more efficient ways of obeying Jesus, even if these other ways do not generate an income. If our faith is in a means of income, even if that means is distributing Christian literature, rather than trusting God to provide, we are not truly living by faith. There will always be a temptation to look for easier ways to do things, like creating literature that sells better or that will be more popular. If we follow that path, it is likely we'll end up like other religious groups that dedicate their time to juggling, singing secular songs, or selling balloon animals and stickers in order to bring in an income. The message is a lot more important than finding something easier to do or to distribute. How to manage funds. Learning how to manage money while remaining spiritually grounded is one of the biggest challenges a Christian community will face. Some people assume that they're more spiritual than they really are because they've never had to make important decisions with respect to material resources that belong to a Christian community. Learning to be responsible with the use of such resources without becoming greedy or worrying about how God will provide for the needs of the community is easier said than done. Money is one of the more polemical issues in any context of life, and this includes intentional communities. Our community has a very clear vision with respect to money. This includes refusing to allow money to be our goal, working for God full-time, renouncing all that we have before becoming part of the community, and sharing all money and possessions equally, etc. For example, before people join, we explain to each individual who wishes to be part of our community that once they have forsaken everything they own, it will not be returned to them in the event they decide to leave the community in future. By making this crystal clear, each person can make a genuine decision to live by faith in God instead of trusting in riches, and they are less likely to have false expectations. Having this issue clear can save us from arguments and contentions about money and wealth when someone leaves. But not all communities will choose to have the same commitment against materialism. Even for those communities that do not have a mission against the materialistic system, it is important to clearly define the principles and rules that will apply for members in respect to money. In some communities, but not in ours, each individual keeps working in the system or in a job they want, keeping their own earnings for themselves, while contributing a fixed monthly quota or percentage of what they earn to the community. These contributions or quotas become part of the common fund that is shared in equal parts for projects, administration, and maintenance costs of the community. Some groups keep a register of how much money and possessions each person brings to the community, with the understanding that when that person leaves, they can take with them money and wealth of the same value they brought. In other groups, all of the members work in system jobs, but give their wages to the group or the leaders who decide how to use the funds. Each community will have to decide how to manage the issue of money. It is extremely important that this is decided before forming a community, and also that the issue is clearly communicated to each person who wants to be part of the community. Having said this, we hope that those reading this article and our other articles will be trying to form communities similar to our own, using the example of primitive Christianity as a guideline. The first Christians sold all their possessions in obedience to Jesus. They lived together, shared everything communally, and worked every day for God, instead of enslaving themselves for money in the world system. Acts 2 verses 44 to 47, and Acts 4 verses 32 to 35. To those communities who choose to follow this model, we can share the following advice with respect to money. Try to ensure that the resources are accessible to as many people in the community as possible. This is important for several reasons. One reason is to avoid abuses that can creep in cases where an individual has exclusive use of the community's resources. We always have in mind that Judas was in charge of the funds in Jesus' small community, and he was tempted to steal money from the common purse for his own uses. John 12 verses 4 to 6. But there are also practical reasons to distribute the resources. It's not always possible to know who or when someone will change their mind and will want to leave the community, or if there is a disagreement which ends in someone being asked to leave. In such cases, problems and temptations can be avoided if such a person does not have exclusive access to whatever resources there are. For example, if you use banks, it's better to have several bank accounts, with each account being in the name of at least 2 people where possible. If this isn't possible, it is advisable to put the account in the name of a more long-standing member who has proven to be responsible and consistent in the faith. This is better than having all the money in just one bank account in the name of just one person. If you have more than one vehicle, it is better to register each vehicle in the names of different people. New members need to learn to first forsake all they have and how to manage resources without abusing that power. For this reason, if someone new joins the community and brings a vehicle registered in their name, we recommend that it is changed to someone else's name. Sometimes the community can use things that someone brought with them, for example a guitar, computer, etc. However, the deceit of wealth is very great and means that many people remain attached to their possessions, seeing them as theirs even after having forsaken them. In general, it is wiser to sell everything and use the money to help the poor or the needs of the community, in order to avoid people making claims on old possessions, being tempted by their proximity. We recommend that the community keeps a budget, which is a register of funds that come in and which can be used by the community. Such a register is useful in understanding what the community is spending its money on and revealing whether it is necessary to downsize or forsake some luxury in order to free up funds for better uses or to plan future projects, etc. Having an open budget enables members to see how funds are being used. It also prevents abuses in the management of the money, including just preventing suspicions about the money possibly being abused. If a community acquires a lot of wealth or needs to manage large sums of money, an investigation into what to do with regard to government taxes will be necessary. This will vary from country to country. In our own community, where we all live by faith and nobody has a secular job, we generally bring in less money than the minimum wage in the countries in which we live. This usually means we don't have to pay taxes, but it is important that each community finds out what the relevant laws of the country are in which they are based. Community members will need to pray for wisdom about how to use its money and assets. There are times when it is best to do without luxuries in order to use money for other projects. The definition of luxuries may vary from community to community. It is something that will need to be discussed from time to time in order to maintain focus and unity. Depending on the mission that the community has, funds will need to be earmarked for such things as printing literature, transport, and charitable projects. It is important to establish clear priorities for the use of community funds. There are also times when we will save more, in both time and money, by spending a bit more up front. For example, to pay for a large shipment of books at a cheaper unit price instead of paying more per unit printing smaller amounts. We just need to ensure that we have enough to spend. We have always operated on the assumption that debts are a form of slavery. It's better not to commit ourselves to things that we do not have the money to pay for. If we do not have the money available for something, we can take it as a sign from God that it is not the moment to go ahead with it, unless God clearly reveals something to the contrary. One of the best ways to avoid going into debt is to think well ahead about future needs. This can involve forming a plan and a budget guide which takes into account those needs and allows for future undertaking of other projects. We need to remember not to worry about the future, and that any plans we make should be God willing. This requires us to stay open to God, cancelling those plans and showing us a different path to take. Good leadership. We have written about the type of leadership that we try to practice in our community in the article Christian Leaders. In order for a community to be successful, there needs to be clear understanding about how decisions will be made. Sometimes there is the temptation to have a relaxed attitude toward leadership. In our community, we have experimented with more anarchic models, where it is not clear how decisions will be made, and where the authority of more experienced people is not recognized, etc. But these experiments have always had poor results. We have found better results when someone, or a couple of people, are recognized as the leaders of the community. These individuals have the responsibility of facilitating the running of the community, and also accepting responsibility for the consequences of whatever decisions are made. Leadership is a demanding job. Even in cases where there is a more relaxed style of leadership, where the leader functions more like a coordinator for what others want, this needs to be carried out with considerable wisdom, care, and foresight. A lazy approach to leadership will only end in unfair situations for everyone involved. In order to have true unity, members of the community, and especially the leaders, must practice transparency and be accountable to each other. At the very least, any leader needs to remain conscious that they will need to give account to God for all that they have done, and recognize that others will judge them harsher than what they judge themselves. When it comes to choosing a leader, having a vote is recommended. although it does not always need to be a formal vote as long as there is general consensus. In very small teams, for example 4 members, there really needs to be a strong feeling of unity. It may be that discussions amongst members may enable the team to arrive at a decision about who should lead or have some kind of responsibility, better than a straight-out ballot. Some communities choose leaders based on their past track record as members. This can be helpful in safeguarding against people becoming lazy with their responsibilities once they have been given the responsibility of leadership. It is important to note that just because someone has a good past track record doesn't automatically mean this will continue. This is why continual assessment and accountability needs to be in place in order to help leaders and followers stay on the rails. Other communities choose leaders on a rotation basis, allowing each person to experience the responsibility of leading the community for a set amount of time. Community members should take their time and not be afraid to discuss the pros and cons of each approach, rediscussing them if necessary when circumstances change. Before leaving this topic, it is important to stress that our spiritual success will not depend on either the style of leadership or the system of government that we choose to adopt. This is the mistake that people make over and over again when they place their hopes in political solutions. Our spiritual success comes from maintaining a humble, honest, loving spirit. We can make any number of mistakes and still be a success if we stay open to the leadings and lessons of the Spirit. Avoiding sexual immorality. It is very important that there is a mutual understanding with respect to the standards any community sets with regards to issues of a sexual nature. A Christian community, for example, would not allow fornication, that is, sex outside of a heterosexual marriage relationship. The topic of marriage itself, with respect to the teachings of Paul and Jesus, about it being better to be single than married, should be spoken about in communities dedicated to following Jesus. Any singles in the community who express a commitment to remaining single need to be supported in their decision in practical and spiritual ways. In any community where there are members of both sexes, situations that could lead to temptation or any kind of public scandal should be avoided. General discussions about topics related to sex should be approached with maturity and sensitivity, but also with confidence. Issues such as flirting and how it affects others needs to be discussed, at least periodically, so that the standards remain clear and are consistently upheld. Comments and discussions about more specific and private sex-related issues, for example masturbation, sexual temptation, etc., should be spoken about exclusively among members of the same sex. This is to avoid embarrassment as well as the temptation to flirt or draw attention to ourselves by raising these kind of issues in a mixed-sex setting. We should not underestimate the benefits of praying for one another in these areas, and we should also not underestimate the need for affection that we all have. Hugs, massages, and other shows of affection between members of the same sex, as well as sincere and deep sharing, help to satisfy the legitimate need that we all have for human contact and companionship, without needing to look for that satisfaction in the sexual relationship. With regards to boyfriend and girlfriend relationships, there is a need to think ahead about what types of relationships will be permitted by the community. The relationship between two people is not the only important aspect to consider, but also the type of message that is communicated to others in the community and outside of it by such behavior. In our community, when a man and woman show a mutual interest in a romantic relationship, we do everything possible for them to remain chaste, without kissing or behaving in any way that will result in possible embarrassment in future, in cases where the couple decides not to get married. Obviously, any couple interested in a marriage relationship needs time to get to know each other in order to decide if they truly want to commit themselves to each other for the rest of their lives. We try to assist with this need by providing opportunities for couples to work together and also speak in private. However, we often try to avoid that the couple spend too much time alone in order to minimize the opportunities for succumbing to temptation. We also do not take lightly the interest in getting married. We consider marriage to be an extremely important decision that requires a lot of prayer and counsel. It is a decision of lifelong duration. In consideration of Jesus' teaching against divorce and remarriage, we understand that there is only one opportunity at such a relationship, unless one or the other spouse passes away. This is even more reason why it is so wise for individuals to consider this issue prayerfully and soberly. Standards for membership. Each community will need to establish conditions for membership that define who will be allowed to be a member. We have always had a dilemma with couples who are in a second marriage, where one of the partners is divorced and remarried, who have wanted to become members of our community. Dilemmas have also arisen with couples in cases where only one party wants to join the community. It requires a lot of wisdom and sensitivity to manage each unique and specific situation. We hope that any community that is based on obedience to the teachings of Jesus will always look for ways to maintain the high standards of Jesus, at the same time that it exercises grace toward others, in sensitivity to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Another challenge with respect to new members is when they come to the community with large debts. There are several ways to manage this, and each community will need to decide what approach is best to take on a case-by-case basis. In general, we have tried to find a way that the person can pay off their own debt to help them learn to take personal responsibility for having indebted themselves. This can be achieved through 1. Working, even if it means continuing to work in the system but using their wage to clear the debt, while they live by grace in the community, which would continue to provide food, accommodation, etc. 2. Selling all of their possessions and using the proceeds to pay their debt or debts. 3. Providing some way that a certain amount of their donations from distributing/community work will be used to pay the debt. Or 4. The community possibly paying a part or even a whole debt for the person. The community will have to decide how much to help economically and how much to help the person learn to take responsibility for their decisions. In our community, we have also used trial periods whenever someone expresses a desire to be a part of our community. This time is necessary for the person to count the cost of living in community and living by faith, to see if it is something that they really want and feel called to do. It also allows time for the community to see if the person is truly committed to the goals of the community, or if they are simply looking for a place where their needs will be provided for. The trial period is often for a week, although it can be for longer if the person or the community needs more time to make a decision. During this trial period, the person lives as a member of the community, but without having made any irreversible decisions, e.g. renouncing all of their material possessions. At the end of the trial period, it can be decided if the person will become a member, or if the trial period should be extended, or if that person shall return to their previous life. Resolving disagreements. The three-step grievance system that we use to resolve disagreements is one of the most useful and biblical practices that we uphold in our community, and we highly recommend it. This system involves us first speaking one-on-one with the person with whom we have a disagreement. If the situation cannot be resolved, 2 or 3 other people are asked to be involved as witnesses. They listen to both sides and give advice and counsel in order to help resolve the disagreement and achieve reconciliation. If the person most at fault does not listen to the witnesses, the disagreement is brought before the whole community to resolve. If someone continues to rebel against what the community decides, then that person is asked to leave. If the person goes away and reaches a point where they are able to accept their fault, and they are willing to resolve it, there is the option of them returning to discuss the matter further, with a possibility of them rejoining the community. See the article Resolving Disagreements. Some people maintain a philosophy of cheap love, in which problems, complaints, and disagreements that arise are supposed to just naturally resolve themselves without any effort on our part. But we have found that the system that Jesus instituted for his community shows a lot more love for others than any philosophy that is based on ignoring problems. Not wanting to correct others when they have erred or sinned does not help them to resolve any spiritual problems, confusion, or doubts they may have. The fruit of not resolving disagreements also leads to bitterness and a false unity, which in reality is not unity at all. It is important not to murmur, gossip, or say negative things about people when they are not present. When it is necessary to speak about someone who is not present, for example because the person about whom we are speaking does not wish to be present or a part of the community, we will need to make the utmost effort to express our thoughts in a way that we would if the person were present. We should also be looking for the first available opportunity to speak to that person about the issues in question. In the case of someone who leaves a sister community to join another that is connected with the first, it may be necessary for the second, receiving community, to be aware of the reasons for the person wanting/needing to leave the first community. If there were any serious offences, for example of a sexual nature, theft, violence, etc., it is fair that the receiving community be made aware of these issues in order to be able to wisely manage the situation. In these cases, it is fair if the person in question is party to what is being said about them to the new receiving community. Offences of a legal nature will also be reported to the police in most cases. Maintaining good physical health. Our community has traditionally organised times for a group run in the form of an organised race in order to help maintain physical fitness. If members are getting other physical exercise on a daily basis, a formal race may not be necessary. However, running or participating in some group sport together is also a way to have fun together in a wholesome way. Running is one of the cheapest forms of exercise there is, and competing with handicaps, where each runner competes against themselves to try and equal or improve their best time, makes it a bit more fun. But each community will need to decide the best way to formulate a system of physical exercise and what this entails. We have seen with some other religious communities, not associated with ours, that when there has been too much freedom given to members, they end up getting used to drinking too much alcohol or eating too much, to the point that some members have become alcoholics and obese. It is worth paying careful attention to any indication that the community is going in this direction. Generally, we have maintained a limit of 2 alcoholic drinks a day, no more than 3 times a week, and it has served us well for many years to help us avoid excesses. This is another topic that requires a lot of prayer, wisdom, and maturity. If self-control, for example drinking in moderation, is difficult for even just one member of the community, it may be necessary for total abstinence on the part of the whole community in solidarity with the weakest member. Maintaining community spirit. To maintain the spirit of community, it is important to look for activities that can involve the whole community. Some activities will be essential for maintaining the vision of the community, while others will simply help to deepen a sense of companionship amongst members. For Christian communities, reading the Bible together will help to reinforce Christian principles in the mind of each person. Christian articles and readings are also important since they relate the teachings in the Bible to issues we face today, and apply these in the context of a community that is living by faith. If the community is too proud to learn from the experience of other communities that have been obeying Jesus for many years, they will be destined to repeat many errors that could have been avoided, and their personal and spiritual growth will be stunted. In our community, we have the tradition of asking each member to share a personal reflection about what we read together. This helps each member to clarify their understanding of the message, and also enables them to learn to discern what is happening spiritually with others. Jesus says that the mouth speaks what is in the heart. If someone does not want to share a reflection about what has been read, or if what they are sharing is not coherent, for example, if they share something ambiguous that could have more than one meaning, it could be an indication that the person is fighting against the message internally. A lot of confusion can be avoided if each member, and especially the leaders, pays attention, listening sincerely to what others are sharing about their understanding of the message. Each evening, it can be decided as a group whether to do some kind of activity together or to have some free or personal time. Group activities could include watching a movie, playing cards, playing some other kind of game, or simply relaxing and talking together. Such activities also serve to help strengthen relationships with each other. Personal growth. It is very important that each member of the community takes responsibility for their own personal spiritual growth. One way of measuring such growth is to think about the spiritual goals we hope to achieve, and to maintain some form of chart or list that can be used to see if such goals are being reached. Without the commitment on the part of the individual to remain faithful to God, there is no way to prevent people from backsliding and changing their mind and going back to the world. Conclusion. We hope that the information and advice laid out in this article is useful for anyone who feels the call to establish a community, or who is considering joining a community such as ours. It is likely that errors will be committed along the way, but more than anything, it is important that we stay connected to God and keep praying for a humble and loving spirit that will help us to continually learn from our mistakes. There is no list of rules that will ever take the place of our own sincere desire to grow spiritually, and no amount of growth as an organization will ever make up for indifference to our own spiritual growth.